There we go. Okay, sorry about that minor glitch. Okay, so the next 40 minutes, I'm going to talk to you about my work as a master's student here. I'm going to give you a brief introduction to the system that I've been working in for the last 3 years. I'm going to discuss each of my chapters. For the sake of time, I won't be going into the first chapter too much, but I'm more than happy to answer any specific questions about the methods or analysis that I did for that. And then lastly, I'm going to wrap up the conclusions and talk about how this research applies to conservation implications. Okay, so barrier islands are thin strips of land which typically lie parallel to the mainland. And the barrier islands on the Atlantic and Gulf Coast of the United States comprise 10% of the global number and almost a quarter of the total global length. And these systems are subject to change due to ocean currents, wave action, sediment supply, strong winds, and storms. And these weather and climate effects result in a dynamic, variable environment. The nature of these systems shapes the habitats that we find there. And you can see from this video on the ocean-facing side to the left of the image, the exposed, unvegetated, sandy beaches. And these sandy beaches are backed by dunes, interior shrub and forest communities, and they culminate in bayside marshlands. This is all the result of succession, and the dynamic nature of these islands shape the species and habitats that we find there. So succession is an ecological process in which newly exposed landforms undergo species structure changes of the ecological community over time. And in coastal barrier islands, communities typically look something like this, where we have the exposed ocean beach that I just showed you in the previous video, dune communities, shrub thickets, forest, and marsh. And this is all a result of change as a result of overwash, which is a process through which sand is deposited on top of the island, disrupting those plant communities and creating new, what we call early successional habitat. And the successional processes are somewhat cyclical with time and as a result of these climate changes. And so we were particularly interested in these ocean, beach, and dune communities, which look something like this, where you can see exposed sand and some early successional species. And these early successional habitats are dominated by beach grass, which is a dune stabilizing plant species, which can withstand up to 1 meter of burial of sand. And this burial can actually even stimulate growth, resulting in increased biomass. And other species found in these habitats are the nitrogen-fixing beach pea, a listed species called sea beach amaranth, and even in some location, poison ivy, which isn't as fun to sample in. And so these early successional habitats are really important for a variety of vertebrate species, including migratory and nesting shorebirds, such as the American oystercatcher, a variety of tern species, and the piping plover. Piping plovers are a federally listed species which winter in the eastern south portion of the North America, shown here in blue. And in the spring, they migrate north to the Great Plains, Great Lakes, and along the northeast Atlantic coast, which is shown in the orange. And after arriving in April, the males establish territories to attract females. Along the Atlantic coast, they rely on this early successional unvegetated habitat in order to allow nesting individuals to perceive incoming or encroaching predators. They typically lay a single clutch within a season of 4 eggs and incubate them for around 28 to 30 days. And in some cases, they will re-nest, especially if they have failure earlier on in the breeding season. And the precocial chicks forage in these moist intertidal habitats, and around 25 days later will fledge. And previous studies have shown that following disturbance events such as hurricanes or large storms, birds will be drawn into these locations, although there will sometimes be a lag in those birds discovering these newly created habitats. So one major cause of decline for the piping plover was habitat loss and degradation. And I'm sure that you have all seen these incredible images from Google of coastal development and urbanization. And with increased coastal development comes increased human recreation, dredging, and a call for beach stabilization projects, such as placement of the sand fencing or dune planting with this native beach grass. So these human-induced habitat changes in combination with the naturally dynamic environment of barrier islands influences the ecology of these environments. As you can imagine, instances of human-wildlife conflict arise when the challenge of balancing these human needs with conservation and species management. And this is particularly of concern when you have species, threatened and listed species such as the piping plover. And you can end up with instances where you get these human-wildlife conflict situations. For example, according to a recent review, 44% of the Atlantic coast had been modified, which may have otherwise been potential nesting habitat for these birds. So one particular disturbance event that occurred along the Atlantic coast was Hurricane Sandy, which made landfall in October 2012. And Hurricane Sandy resulted in an increased potential habitat for these nesting plovers. As you can see here, the result of overwashes and island breaches, such as this area here, increased the amount of this early successional habitat. However, due to the concern for human safety as a result of these damages to coastal infrastructure, there was a call for protection, particularly for the area we were looking in, which was on coastal New York. So the US Army Corps of Engineers initiated a stabilization project to protect Long Island by stabilizing two barrier islands called Fire Island and an western portion of Westhampton Island. And this project would disturb a population of breeding plovers, and hence was subject to a biological opinion by the US Fish and Wildlife Service. So as I mentioned, we were particularly interested in coastal New York, and our study area was Fire Island here on the left, and a smaller portion shown in pink here of Westhampton Island. And like many areas along the northeast Atlantic coast, this coastline has been subject to a lot of human modification, as well as increased coastal development and recreation. And the colors you see here indicate the different management units that were responsible for those lands. And that's important because it leads to a difference in habitat management and species management as well. So following Hurricane Sandy, we identified 4 post-hurricane habitats. There were areas along Fire Island which overwashed, which is, as I described earlier, is areas where you get this deposition of sand and sediment on top of existing vegetation communities. And within our study area, we had these areas which we reference as natural overwash, which were not modified once they had been overwashed during the hurricane, they were just left. Additionally, these areas were on National Park Service property, so there was very limited human disturbance as well as no beach driving. However, in other locations, we identified areas where, following overwash, sand fencing had been placed, as well as this dune planting that I previously mentioned. And we referred to these areas as manipulated overwashes. And the number shown here in parentheses, this is the total area of that habitat type as of 2015. So in other locations, we witnessed the breaching of the island, which is where the ocean waters rush across the island, entering the bay waters. And in 2 locations, the US Army Corps of Engineers actually filled these sites, which resulted in these areas of, exposed unvegetated dry sand. And lastly, in response to this stabilization project, the US Army Corps of Engineers created 2 restoration sites, which were specifically designed to be nesting habitat for piping plovers on Fire Island. And the idea was that they would mimic otherwise naturally occurring overwash, which may have happened without a stabilization project. So this area on the left is called Great Garden Restoration Area, and the area on the right is called the New May Dredge Fill Restoration Area. And as you can see, they're both quite different in their design. The one on the left is a lot larger. This whole area was grubbed, so vegetation was ripped out from the sediment. It was also lowered in elevation, and it's bordered by these mature dunes. And on the right, the New May Dredge Fill site was a lot smaller. It was sand, which was essentially dumped on top of old dredge materials. So there was still plant matter within the organic ground. And that was bordered by these dense borders of common reed or Phragmites. So these habitat changes on Fire Island led me to develop 3 specific questions for my thesis. Firstly, given these habitat changes, we wanted to identify the most accurate method for classifying aerial imagery in order to identify these habitat changes. And as I said, this is the one I'll be speaking the least about. The second question was to look at how the vegetation had changed across these 4 post-hurricane habitats using the information that we had learned from the first chapter. And then lastly, look at how the piping plovers had used these 4 post-hurricane habitats, specifically the US Army Corps of Engineers designed restoration areas. Okay, so the first chapter, assessing these classification methods. So as some of you may realize, within ecology and wildlife research, we heavily rely on land cover maps to infer different metrics for species management, such as habitat availability, resource use, movement patterns. And in recent years, there has been an increase in accessibility for these remotely collected data, such as aerial and satellite imagery. However, a lot of the assessment of these data have been based in either urban environments or in forested or agricultural environments. And so given our unique dynamic habitat on the coast, we wanted to ask the same questions about classification, but from our system. And our hope is that in understanding these methods better, we can offer advice for other folks working in similar environments. So in order to do this, we took a subset of our aerial imagery, which was collected in February 2016. And we chose this area because it represented all of the habitat types that we were interested in for piping plover habitat use, and also for a common nest predator, the red fox. And so as you can see, the 15 centimeters here references the resolution of the imagery, which if you know anything about imagery, that's incredibly high. That looks something like this if you're on the ground, or if you're a plover, it looks something like this. And so in order to find the best method for classifying this high resolution image, we compared 3 methods. And I'm not going to go into the specifics of them, but again, I'm happy to answer questions about that later. So from an image, we can derive information about the spectral signatures of each of the pixels within that image. But to a plover, that doesn't really mean anything. So what they're actually interested in is, what does it look like on the ground? So we compared these 3 methods, and we found that the highest accuracy was using this third method, the supervised object-based. And not only did it have highest overall accuracy, but it also had high accuracy in the habitat types that we were interested in. So here you'll see along the x-axis, these are the different habitat types. And the last column here is the overall accuracy. And along the y-axis is the accuracy in percentage. And so each of the three methods are represented in orange, blue, and green. And green, the supervised object-based method, had that highest overall accuracy, as we saw in the last slide. And it also had the highest accuracy for beach grass, so those areas that we see in the early primary dunes, and also dry sand here. So in answer to that first question, what was the most accurate method for identifying land cover types on these New York barrier islands? Well, we saw that the supervised object-based classification had the highest overall accuracy. It also had the highest accuracy for those dry sand and beach grass communities. And this is important because if we're going to derive estimates of land cover area from our images, we want to make sure that we are accounting for this accuracy. Okay, so in chapter 2, I wanted to use what we had learned from the first chapter about identifying habitat types and tried to get at how some of the vegetation succession had changed following Hurricane Sandy. So as you remember, there's the 4 habitat categories: the breach fill, manipulated overwash, natural overwash, and restoration areas. And each of these habitat types were represented by at least 2 sites. So the objectives of this chapter were to quantify the proportion of vegetation cover in the 4 post-habitat types, and also quantify the vegetation density, because this may be important for nesting plovers in terms of their nest site selection. So in order to do that, we used aerial imagery, which was collected in the spring and fall of 2013, 15, 16, and 17. And produce classification maps using that object-based classification approach. In this case, we actually just condensed the classes into 4 because this made the most sense for the questions we were asking. And then we also clipped each annual classification to the high tide in order to account for habitat that might be lost due to high tide events. And the interior habitat boundaries here were defined using either field collected data or descriptions provided by the US Army Corps of Engineers. So to get at the vegetation density, we conducted transects in the planted dunes and in the natural overwashes. And these ran 50 meters north from the south toe of the dune. And every 10 meters, we placed down an adapted density board and took a picture 1 meter back from the board to get indices of vegetation density. And at each sample location, we collected the date, season, the species that were present, the type. So this refers to whether it was either planted or whether it was a natural overwash area. And elevation, which we derived from LiDAR, which was collected every year at our site. So for each sample, you would get an image that looks something like this, and we would count the number of squares that were obscured by greater than 50% vegetation matter. So in this case, I'm not going to ask you guys to guess. It's just 2. So that would be those bottom 2 down there. And sometimes your fellow graduate students will help you in assessing what the vegetation density is. So to answer some of these questions about vegetation cover and density, for the cover, we used a generalized linear model with an interactive effect. In this case, we included the habitat type, the age, so this is the number of years since the disturbance occurred within that habitat type. So for the natural overwashes, that would have been 2012 when it first occurred, but the restoration areas were younger, so they were only completed in 2015. And then we included the season, either spring or fall. And then to assess those indices that we collected on vegetation density, we used a zero inflated Poisson mixed effects model. And for this, we looked at type. So that was either the planted or natural. The year, which was collected in 16 or 17. Season, which in this case was actually either spring or summer. And elevation, as well as a random effect to account for spatial autocorrelation. And any continuous variables were scaled. We created a model set based on a combination of all of those covariates and an information theoretic and AICC model ranking approach to identify a top model. Okay, so if we just look at the proportion of vegetation across those 4 habitat types, we see that there's annual increases. So along the x-axis you have the year, S is spring and F is fall, and proportion along the y-axis. And you can see each of the habitat types increased annually. And what you'll notice, which I think is really interesting, is that each line represents a site within that habitat type. So all 3, the breach fill, natural and manipulated, all sites followed quite a similar trend within their own respective habitat type. But in the restoration area, we see that the 2 sites actually deviated slightly from each other in the way that they were revegetating, which if you think back to the original introduction of those sites, the 2 sites were quite different. So that may explain some of the variation that we're seeing here. So what does that look like? If you're a visual learner like me, I like to see pictures. So if we take one of those sites from the manipulated overwash, you can see that through time, the areas of green, which represent the vegetation, increase, and you get these larger patches of vegetation developing within those natural overwashes. Sorry, excuse me, manipulated overwashes. So when we modeled those results, we found that we had 2 competing models. Our top model included all of those covariates that I previously described. And we see that anything that falls to the left of the dashed line is a negative effect. Anything that falls to the right is positive. And if it overlaps, then there was no significant effect. So interestingly, there was no significant effect alone of habitat type, but once we accounted for that interaction with age, we can see that there was higher proportion of vegetation in these natural and manipulated overwashes, and this is compared to the breach, in this case is the reference habitat type. And this can partly be explained by the character of those habitat types, where in those overwashes, we had sediment that was deposited on top of the existing plant material versus sites where they were, vegetation was pulled out and removed. So for the vegetation density transects, we collected 66 transects, 50 from the planted dunes and 16 from the natural overwashes. And this resulted in 678 samples from spring and summer of 16 and 17. And just to note that we actually only collected the natural overwash density samples in 2017. And as I mentioned before, we ended up with this non-normal distribution of our indices, which is why we used the model that we did. So our top model in this case included year type, so that was whether it was planted or natural, season and elevation. And here we can see that there was lower vegetation densities in those planted dunes versus the natural overwash, which makes sense given that some of these planted areas can take 2 to 5 years to establish, whereas the natural sites already had the existing plant material and they were potentially responding positively to that burial. There's also, as we might expect, a lower density during the spring and a higher density in subsequent years. Okay, so to come back to that question, so how has vegetation changed across those 4 post-hurricane habitat types? Well, we saw that there were annual increases across all of the sites, which we would expect. There's a higher proportion of vegetation in those sites where plants were buried versus actually being mechanically or hurricanically removed. There were higher densities in those natural versus the planted dunes, which further supports this idea of plants being buried versus being removed. And interestingly, there were those differences between the 2 restoration sites in the proportion of vegetation within them. And that there were lower proportions in density in spring, showing a seasonal effect. Okay, so my last chapter, you'll remember from my introduction that these plovers rely on this early successional habitat in order to nest. So we wanted to look at how they were using these post-hurricane habitats. Specifically, how were these US Army Corps of Engineers designed restoration sites ecologically functioning compared to these other post-hurricane habitats. And you'll remember that there were 2 sites that were created. Previous research from the Missouri River has shown that plovers will use these human-created habitats when they have the availability. So the objectives for this chapter were to quantify the habitat availability and identify any selection if there was any occurring. Look at reproductive success, so this was nest success, brood success, and chick condition. And also assess whether these restoration areas were functioning in a similar way. Okay, so in order to answer these objectives, we collected data on breeding piping plovers on Fire Island and Westhampton Island in 2015 to 2017. And the reason that we started from 15 was because that was the first year that the restoration areas were complete, so it allowed comparison across all 4 habitat types. So we arrived in April and began surveying, looking for birds that were there, either from previous years or new birds. If we found a nest, we would mark it with a GPS. We would then trap and uniquely mark all of the adults. And then when the chicks hatched, we would mark them in the same fashion, also recording their mass. And then around 25 days later, we would go out with these very glamorous butterfly nets and try and recapture the chicks and take their weight. And then we would continue to monitor them throughout the breeding season until around the end of August. And we also used these classifications that I previously mentioned in the last chapter in order to get an area of available habitat. Okay, so for this chapter, we calculated pair density, which was based on the number of pairs in each habitat type divided by the amount of sand hectares. And we also looked at the proportion of use versus availability. And then to assess nest and brood success, we used a generalized linear model, including fixed effects for habitat type, geomorphic location, and this just referenced whether they were on the beach front, whether they were in the dune, or whether they were further towards the bayside in their nest location. Year, distance to water, and distance to vegetation, which were proxies for the potential risk of flooding or predation. And then whether the nest had an exclosure, which you'll remember there was an image from the introductory slide about land managers placing them in some locations. And then for brood success, we looked at habitat type, geomorphic location again, year, and then we accounted for brood size. And then to look at chick condition, we used pre-fledgling chick mass, which can be an indicator of condition, especially in cases where you don't have size corrected estimates. And for this, we used a generalized linear mixed effect models looking at habitat type, which in this case is the habitat type in which the chick nest hatched out in, year, chick age, and pair density in which the nest was when they hatched. And the pair density was to account for any potential interspecific competition among individuals. And then we accounted for parental care using nest ID as a random effect. And again, we scaled any continuous variables. We created a model set of all of the combination of covariates and used this information theoretic and AICC model ranking approach. Okay, so from 2015 to 2017, we monitored 67 pairs, 83 nests, and we included all renests where they occurred, 50 broods, and 91 fledglings, 71 of which we recaptured. As you can see, we didn't have 100% recapture rate. Okay, so across the 4 habitat types, This is showing the number of pairs and pair density. So along the x-axis, you'll see the year. Along the y-axis is the pairs per available sand hectares. And the number that is shown above the dashed line is the number of pairs, and the actual dashed line itself is the pair density. So you'll see that all of these pair densities increase across the breach fill, manipulated and natural overwashes. And in the restoration sites, it was somewhat variable between years. So if we look at how that relates to selection of those 4 habitat types, you'll see that the habitat types are marked in these colors again, the same colors again. And this figure is, along the x-axis, is the expected versus relative observed use with 95% confidence intervals, and the year shown here along the y-axis. And essentially, if a point and the 95% confidence intervals fall to the left of this dashed line, then there was selection against. If it falls to the right of that line, then there was selection for. So you'll see in 2016 and 15, there was no selection, so all of these points fall across the line. But in 2017, we saw that there was actually selection for these breach fill sites, which is here in the pink, and selection against those restoration sites in relation to the available area, which is shown here. So our top rank model for the nest success included year, geomorphic location, and exclosure. You'll notice that it didn't include habitat type. And there was a higher success with those nests that did have those land manager placed exclosures. And then brood success, our top model included year and the number of chicks. Again, no effect of habitat type. The number of chicks makes some sense if you consider that the more chicks you have, the more likely you are to succeed in producing some fledglings. And then for chick condition, here I'm just showing you essentially the variability between years. So each year has its own figure with the habitat type along the x-axis and chick mass along the y-axis. And this number that's above the habitat type just indicates the mean age at which we recaptured those chicks within that habitat type. So you'll notice that many of them were around 22 days, but in some cases it was closer to 24 or 21. And you'll see that nobody was recaptured in these 2 habitat types in 2015. And that was because there wasn't any chicks produced there. And as you can see, there is variation between years and within habitat types. So when we look at the effects from our top model, there was no effect of habitat type again, but there was a lower chick condition in 2017 compared to 15. And as we might expect, the older chicks got, the higher their mass was. Okay, so coming back to the question for this chapter, we saw that the restoration sites did attract plovers. So in that sense, there was some success, but the nest numbers and pair numbers were variable. And in 2017, we did notice this selection against those sites, although why that is would still require some further investigation. Interestingly, there was no effect of habitat type on any of those reproductive success parameters that we discussed. But there was annual variation supporting the idea that we need to continue monitoring these species in order to get a longer term data set, which thankfully Sam is kindly doing. So just to bring this all together, from the first chapter, we saw that the object-based classification approach had the highest overall accuracy, as well as high accuracy for these early successional habitats, which hopefully will be useful to other people who wish to carry out classifications. In the second chapter, we saw that there was an increase in vegetation cover following Hurricane Sandy. There was also a higher proportion of vegetation where plants were buried versus being entirely removed, and higher densities in natural overwashes than in those newly planted dunes. And lastly, there was an increase in pair numbers, nests, and fledglings across the whole of our study area. But specifically, those restoration sites did attract some plovers during our years of monitoring. Although in relation to its area, it was perhaps not being used as much as we might expect. There was, interestingly, no effect of habitat type on any of those reproductive success parameters, but there was some annual variation. And one of the things I mentioned earlier is that sometimes there can be a delay in birds discovering new available nesting habitat or nesting sites. And so in that instance, it could be the fact that some of these sites just haven't been got to yet, haven't been maximized yet. Okay, so why does this matter? Why did we do all of this? Well, firstly, I think it's really important to understand the accuracy of deriving land cover metrics from imagery, especially given that we depend so much upon them as ecologists. And if early successional habitat in these areas is the goal of land managers, then habitat management is likely required given those increases in vegetation that we saw through time. And particularly, given the differences that we saw between the two restoration sites, we would encourage there some consideration of the design as well as expectations. And lastly, given the future models predicting increased storm intensity, these coastal stabilization projects are likely to increase. So if we wish to conserve early successional species, it's going to be really important that we consider how our actions feed into the ecology of these systems. So I would like to thank so many people. Firstly, all of the fantastic folks that we worked with on Fire Island and Westhampton Island, allowing us to access their sites and coordinating with us. All of the great technicians who we wouldn't be able to do this work without, some of whom have come today, which is fantastic. Funding for me personally came from the Roanoke Bird Club scholarship in 16 and 17, as well as travel awards from the GSA. And these wonderful people who donated images for this presentation. And of course, you can't not thank your PIs. So, I've been fortunate enough to work with these three people, particularly the last couple of years, and they don't just sit around eating cake. They also are very, very proactive about coming out in the field and joining us, which brings its own interesting memories. And of course, I can't thank enough Steve, who is my other committee member, who has been very patient in hours of plover discussion, as well as educating us on remote sensing and GIS. So thank you guys very much. Yeah, I think it's really easy to forget how many people contribute to these kinds of work. And so this is just as many as I can remember, but I'm sure there are many more. All of the technicians who have helped collect data, as well, specifically those folks and support from my fellow lab mates in the Shorebird Lab. And I particularly want to thank this lady. Me and Sam both started on this graduate project together back in 2016, and I don't think either of us were quite prepared for what we were taking on. And so it's been a real pleasure working with her, and she has really shown me the value of hard work. And obviously all of the staff in the Fish and Wildlife Department, the professors, as well as all of the support staff, thank you very much. And the graduate school, the international student support services who have had to put up with me frantically figuring out visa issues, and also the student support for students with disabilities as well. Thank you for your help. And all of the other people who make up my life. all of my family and friends from the UK who have supported me to be here, my dog who has shown me the value of being cool, and other previous mentors who, frankly, I probably wouldn't be here without, who've supported me and encouraged me to do this work. So with that, I will take any questions. Hey. Sure. Yeah, so the question was, do you have any explanation for why the two restoration sites recovered in slightly different ways? Is that correct? So I think, as I alluded to, a lot of it has to do with the design of the two sites. The first one, Great Gun, is almost like an extended backshore, which is firstly a very large area. And secondly, the species that dominate there are more of the beach grass, which will propagate through rhizomes, but a lot of that rhizome material was actually removed when the site was made. Conversely, at the new made site, it was, well, firstly, it's a lot smaller and it's very heavily bordered by Phragmites, which is a very invasive species. And a lot of that material from the Phragmites remained at the site even after they dumped sand on top of it. And that's another species which commonly will respond to burial. So I think that's most likely what's happened, and why you saw more vegetation at the new made site than the Great Gun site. Does that answer your question? Hey. Thank you. So the question was, how did I define availability? So in this case, availability was the anything that was classified as dry sand. So from those classifications, I had the four classes: the vegetation, dry sand, water, and wet sand. And so anything that was classified as dry sand would have been considered available. And I classified for each year, so you would account for any change through time, right? The one thing I will say is that I've been really curious about the threshold at which you can identify vegetation through an image. This is super nerdy, but so in discussion with other people and through some tests of my own, I think that around once, say you have like a meter square, once you get more than 20% cover within that meter, I think you can then detect it, but anything less than that doesn't quite get detected as well through classification processes. So I'm really happy to talk more about that later. Hey, yeah.
This question more about background on the Plover listed 30 years ago, and so you're going to study 30 years later. What is the prognosis for it reaching any recovery?
Oh, wow. Okay. So the question was, what is the prognosis for the piping plover given that it was listed 30 years ago? Where do I start? I will say that one of the things we have noticed at our site is that we have seen an increase in pairs since, because we've been working there since 2013, and we have seen an increase in pairs since Hurricane Sandy. However, locally and regionally, the numbers haven't been particularly great. The productivity hasn't been particularly great. And I think that our sites actually are contributing a lot to that, to those regional numbers. So at this point, I don't know. I'm going to remain optimistic.
But if there is a quantitative target for recovery?
Yes, yes, there is. Yeah, actually, I have that information here. I just put together a couple of extra slides in case people wanted to talk about anything else. Yeah, so these are actually the regional recovery goals for the piping plover. And so the New York, New Jersey district down here in the bottom left is where we would fall into. And you can see that the number of pairs has been quite consistently quite low, apart from the 2007. I haven't got actually the exact number on here right now, but you can see it's just below 600. So does that answer your question? Yeah, great.
Doesn't look good.
Anyone else?
Good question. All right, well, let's thank Ken again, and